I'm Tracy Carver, 31 years old, and last month my parents drove 3 hours unannounced just to sit in my condo and ask for something unthinkable. They didn't bring food or even a housewarming gift. They brought my sister, her fiancé, and a dream home listing worth $1.5 million. By the end of that conversation, they were asking me to hand over $1 million of my own hard-earned money to cover her future with a man I barely knew. That was the moment everything I had held back for years finally broke open, and I realized just how deep the divide in our family truly ran. Before I go any further, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, and hit like and subscribe. If you've ever had to set boundaries with the very people who raised you. I was born and raised on the north side of Austin, Texas, in one of those middle-class neighborhoods where every yard looked tidy, but no one talked much past the mailbox. My dad, Roger, managed a car dealership, and my mom, Vicky, worked. Long hours as an accountant. They were practical people who believed in saving money and working hard values. They made sure we heard often enough, especially when it came to me. I was their first child. Quiet, bookish, always scribbling drawings of houses and daydreaming about designing buildings. Someday I thought we were a family that valued ambition, that if you showed discipline and effort, you'd be supported. Then came Natalie, 4 years younger with a head full of curls and a flair for anything that sparkled, while I saved my allowance to buy graph paper and sketched dream homes after school. Natalie twirled around the living room, pretending to be on a runway. By the time she was 5, she was enrolled in a local fashion camp that cost more than our mortgage. I remember asking once if I could take an art class too. Mom smiled and said, "Maybe next year," but that next year never came. The pattern set in. Early birthdays were different Christmases too. I'd get things like a math workbook or a new backpack while Natalie unwrapped tablets, designer sneakers, even a karaoke machine. Once when I turned 10, they baked a cake and handed me a sketchbook. Natalie's 6th birthday had a bounce house, a face painter, and catered snacks. When I asked why mine was so quiet, Mom said, Natalie needed the spotlight because she was more social. I didn't argue, I just nodded and cleaned up the plates afterward. By the time high school rolled around, I'd learned not to ask for much. I studied hard, kept a job at a coffee shop, and filled my evenings with clubs and volunteer hours. I dreamed of studying architecture at USC and even landed a partial scholarship, just enough to make me believe I could actually go. Dad had always told me I was the responsible one, smart enough to make things happen on my own. I took that as a compliment, until I found out it was really an excuse. Because when I finally sat them down after graduation to talk about tuition, Mom and Dad exchanged one of their long, quiet glances and told me the money just wasn't there. They spoke gently, said, college costs were out of control, that I'd do fine with loans and more scholarships. But there was no help coming from them. I didn't cry at the table, not in front of Natalie, who was scrolling through photos on her phone, like none of this mattered. I waited until my bedroom door was closed, then cried into my pillow until my throat ached. They said I was smart. They said I'd figure it out, and that's exactly what they expected me to do next. I spent that summer chasing any way to close the gap between my scholarship and the tuition bill. I couldn't afford. I filled out grant applications by day and scoured student loan sites by night. But no matter how many numbers I crunched, USC kept slipping further out of reach. My parents had made up their minds. They weren't paying a cent. And even when I showed them the final cost breakdown, Dad just repeated the same thing. "You're smart, Trace. You'll figure it out." That was his way of ending the conversation. By mid-July, I stopped checking the USC portal. Was too painful. Instead, I sent in my paperwork to the University of Texas in Austin. They had a solid architecture program and offered me a partial ride enough to make it work. If I pushed hard, my parents didn't offer to help with books or supplies or even the dorm deposit. I packed my things in silence and caught a ride with a friend whose older brother was heading the same way. My new schedule was a grind from the start. I opened the campus bookstore at 5A. M worked until 9, then rushed to classes that ran until 2. After a quick bite in the student union, I caught the bus to a downtown diner where I waitressed from 4 until midnight, sometimes later, depending on tips. I kept a pair of flats in my bag because my feet throbbed. After hours on tile floors, I studied in the back booth when it was slow and ate leftover fries. If the kitchen didn't toss them first. My dorm room was barely big enough for 3 beds and a few shelves, but it was all I had after closing. I'd come in and try not to wake my roommates. As I dropped onto the mattress, still in my work uniform, sometimes I'd sleep in jeans just to save time in the morning. I carried flashcards in my apron pocket, reviewed building codes and historical styles on my breaks. Somehow I kept my GPA at 3.6 high enough to hold on to my scholarship, but it felt like walking a tightrope every day. I didn't tell anyone how bad it got, not even the friends I'd met in studio or the girls from my dorm. My phone stayed quiet, except for occasional texts from Mom asking if I'd remembered to register for the next semester, or Dad forwarding news articles about rising tuition costs. Neither asked how I was eating or whether I had time to sleep back home. Natalie was wrapping up senior year at a private high school. She posted photos from spring break in Florida and weekend shopping trips with captions like, "New season, new style," while I refilled coffee cups and wiped down tables at midnight when she got accepted to Baylor. My parents threw her a dinner party, complete with balloons and catered food. I only found out when I saw the photos online. I had worked a double shift that day, covering for someone who'd called out sick. When Thanksgiving rolled around, I caught a bus home with a duffel bag of laundry and a paper. Due Monday, I walked in just as Natalie was describing her new homecoming dress and how hard it was to choose between 2 sororities. I mentioned my classes in the diner, but Mom frowned and said, working that much might be hurting my grades. I told her I had a 3.6, and she nodded, but reminded me the scholarship required a 3.5 minimum. No praise, no questions. Just a warning not to lose the only support they weren't providing. Christmas wasn't much better. Natalie unwrapped a designer bag and airline tickets for a trip to Italy with her friends. I got a gift card to the bookstore, $50 more than I expected, but it felt like something they grabbed last minute on the way to the register when dinner ended. I volunteered to do the dishes just to have something to do with my hands. Mom thanked me but didn't notice. I was swallowing back tears over the sink. After that, I stopped coming home for holidays. I signed up for extra shifts or said I had exams. Monica Platt, my dorm roommate, noticed I stayed behind that spring and invited me to spend Easter with her family in Houston. Her parents were both public school teachers, warm and curious and genuinely interested in what I was studying. They asked to see my sketches and listened as I described a project I was working on for class. When Monica's dad said, "You're really talented, Tracy," it was the first time in a long while that I believed it. Monica became the sister I never had. She'd leave granola bars on my desk when I worked late and text me reminders to eat when I skipped dinner. Her family treated me like I mattered, not because of what I could do, but because of who I was. Their house was noisy and full of books and mismatched mugs. And I felt more at home there in a weekend than I ever had in my parents' house. Since I was a kid by sophomore year, things started to shift. I traded the bookstore job for a paid internship at a small architecture firm in town. It didn't pay much, but they let me work some hours remotely, and the experience counted toward my degree. I still waitressed 3 nights a week, but it gave me more room to breathe. My GPA crept back up to 3.8, and I started seeing glimmers of what my future could look like. Natalie started at Baylor that fall, and her Instagram turned into a stream of tailgate parties, sorority mixers, and perfectly lit selfies in boutique outfits. My parents covered her tuition, gave her a credit card, and rented her a furnished apartment near campus. She texted me once to ask which heels to wear to a formal event. I answered during a break in the firm's copy room while microwaving rice and leftover chicken junior year. I designed my first real project, a community center for a nonprofit on the east side. Nothing fancy, just clean lines and sustainable materials. But seeing something I drafted turn into a building made me feel like the years of struggle meant something. The firm offered me a job after graduation. Modest salary, but steady work. I accepted without hesitation. My parents didn't come to my graduation. They had a weekend getaway planned with Natalie to celebrate her junior year. Instead, Mom said to pictures. Monica's parents sat in the front row and clapped so loudly when my name was called that I couldn't stop smiling. Her mom handed me a leather planner with my initials embossed in gold. No one had ever given me something so thoughtful. That summer, I moved into a small apartment with 2 roommates and started working full-time. I made $45,000 a year, enough to cover rent and start chipping away at my $60,000 in student loans. I brought lunch from home, skipped social outings, and said no to anything I couldn't afford. The only thing I splurged on was therapy once a week, in a quiet office above a florist shop. My therapist helped me name things I hadn't been able to before. She said, "Tracy, you've been trained to believe you have to suffer to earn anything good." And for the first time, I understood what that meant. I wasn't trying to be distant with my parents. We still exchanged polite texts and called on birthdays, but they never asked how my job was going or what I was working on. I sent a photo when I bought my first condo, a small place on the east side, clean lines, tall windows, nothing fancy. But it was mine. Mom replied with a heart emoji. Dad wrote back, "Nice work, kid." Natalie didn't say anything. I thought that was the end of it. I had built a life that didn't depend on them, and it felt quiet, peaceful even. But then the doorbell rang one evening, and when I opened it, they were all standing there, Mom, Dad, and Natalie, smiling like it was a Sunday visit, not the start of something that would change everything. I stood there in the doorway for a moment, not quite believing what I was seeing. Mom and Dad smiling like they hadn't skipped my graduation. Natalie behind them in a blazer that probably cost more than my couch. No one mentioned calling ahead. They just said they were nearby and thought they'd stop in. I stepped aside and let them in out of habit. More than anything, Dad walked slowly through the living room, glancing at the built-in shelves and open kitchen, his tone surprised when he said, "This is nice, like maybe he expected something less." Mom touched the edge of the dining table, ran her hand along the smooth wood like she was measuring its worth. Natalie wandered over to the bookshelf, picked up a vase, set it down and turned her attention to her phone. I offered to order pizza since I didn't have much in the fridge. They agreed, and we ended up sitting around the table eating. In near silence, conversation floated through the safe zones. Whether local construction traffic on I-35. Natalie barely touched her food, and Dad kept clearing his throat like he was working up to something. After a while, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He said, "We need to have a family meeting." Mom nodded, her eyes shifting toward Natalie, who straightened up and held out her hand, a diamond ring flashing in the overhead light. She said, "Gavin proposed we're getting married next year." I blinked, surprised, not just by the news, but by how far out of the loop I was. They told me Gavin's last name was Dempsey, that he was a financial analyst, and came from a respectable family. Natalie pulled out her phone and started swiping through a mood board filled with images of marble floors, high ceilings, and chandeliers. She said, "We're buying a place together, something big where we can host and build our brand." I wasn't sure what that meant, but nodded politely and said, "Congratulations." Then Dad mentioned a house just outside Austin listed at one point. $5 million, Mom chimed in with, "It's a great investment." And Natalie added that anything smaller would be beneath them in their circle. The word investment repeated a few times before the real reason for their visit slipped out. They said Gavin's parents were supposed to contribute but had backed out, and now they were short. $1 million. I didn't say anything at first. Just set my plate down slowly, waiting for the rest of it to come out. Mom smiled gently and said, "They thought maybe I could help with the cost," Dad added. "We know your business is doing well." It was said like a compliment, but carried the weight of expectation. Natalie looked straight at me and said, "You don't have a family to support, and you've always been good with money." I asked them to repeat what they were asking just to be sure, And they did $1 million for a house Natalie hadn't even moved into yet. She said this isn't just a house. It's our future, and the people we'll meet there will change everything. Dad said, family helps family. And Mom added that Natalie would do the same for me. I reminded them of USC, of the tuition breakdown I'd brought to that dinner table years ago when they told me to take out loans and figure it out myself. They said that was different because I'd had scholarships. Mom waved it off like it was ancient history. Natalie rolled her eyes and said, I needed to let it go, she said. I'd always acted like I was better than everyone else, and this was my chance to prove I wasn't. I stood up from the table, hands flat against the wood, trying to keep steady. I said, no, I wouldn't pay for their house. I listed everything they had given her over the years, and how I'd scraped by while they looked the other way. Dad looked angry and said, if that's how I felt, maybe we didn't need to stay in touch. I told him that was his choice, but I wasn't going to be guilted or used. They left without another word, the front door closing harder than it needed to. I stood there alone in the quiet condo, the pizza still sitting on the table getting cold. My heart was pounding, but I didn't regret what I'd said. For the first time I hadn't swallowed it the next day, Natalie posted something online, something vague about betrayal and family disappearing when you need them. It spread quickly. Her followers chiming in with you, deserve better and stay strong. Girl, I didn't respond, but I saw it, and so did plenty of others. My Aunt Glenda called first, saying she heard I'd refused to help Natalie and that Mom was heartbroken. I told her it was private, but she pushed, saying family always helped each other. I asked her if she had ever given someone $1 million. She went quiet after that, but more calls came in. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Uncles I barely knew all. Saying the same thing, that I was being cold, that I should be grateful for where I'd ended up. Then one afternoon I overheard a client mention that someone had raised concerns about the stability of my firm. A competitor had caught wind of the drama and was spreading rumors. It was the first time Natalie's posts had moved beyond personal. It was touching my work, and that scared me more than I expected. Mom texted to say they'd taken out a loan to cover the deposit and things were tight. Now, she didn't ask for money directly, just let it hang there unspoken. I sat with that message for a long time, staring at it without knowing what to say. When I finally told Monica what was happening, she shook her head and said they were crossing. Every line there was, she said. If I didn't start drawing boundaries now, it would never stop. Her words echoed something my therapist had said months ago, that saying no wasn't cruel. It was survival. The messages didn't stop. Mom sent a group text to the extended family saying the house deal was falling apart because I wouldn't help people. I barely remembered were now reaching out to tell me how disappointed they were in me. Then a text came from a number I didn't recognize. It was Gavin, Natalie's fiancé. He said he wanted to meet just the two of us, said there were things I needed to know. I wasn't sure at first, but something in his message felt different, so I agreed. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those quiet places with big windows and soft chairs, the kind where no one looks up. When the door opens, Gavin was already there when I arrived, sitting near the back in a gray suit with his hands wrapped around a paper cup. He stood when he saw me, said thanks for coming, and gestured to the seat across from him. We made small talk for a minute or two, just long enough to get through the awkwardness before he leaned forward and said, Natalie's really upset about the house. I didn't respond right away. Just let him keep going, he said. Her parents are considering another loan to cover the missing piece, a big one this time, and he wasn't sure they fully understood the risk. He told me they'd already borrowed $150,000 at a high interest rate just to hold the deposit, and that the monthly payments were starting to bite into their accounts. Mom was still working, but Dad's retirement check didn't stretch like it used to. The words sat between us for a minute. No one reaching to pick them up, I asked why he was telling me all this, and he looked down, then back up again. He said, because Natalie hasn't told you everything. Not about the house, and not about her own finances. I waited. He said, she has $75,000 in credit card debt, and he only found out last week. He rubbed his forehead like he was still trying to believe it. She told him it was normal that everyone carried that much these days, and she had it under control. But he wasn't sure anymore, especially not with how fast things were moving. I asked again why he came to me, and he said he didn't know who else would listen, and he thought I should at least have the facts. I sat back in the chair processing the numbers. The silence stretched, but he didn't fill it. He just let it settle when we left the cafe. He said thank you for meeting. And I nodded but didn't promise anything that night. I called Clifford Heeman, my mentor, someone who had seen me through the early years of the firm. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Tracy, you didn't build this company to rescue anyone, and you're not responsible for fixing mistakes you didn't make." His words steadied me, but the image of my parents drowning in loans for a house that hadn't even broken ground kept circling back, and I couldn't quite shake it, not fully. A few days later, I got a call from my cousin, Corey Stovall. He's a lawyer based in Houston, level-headed, and never one to take sides. He said he'd heard about the situation and wanted to help find a way forward. No yelling, no drama, just facts. He offered to arrange a meeting at a restaurant halfway between Austin and San Antonio, someplace neutral. I agreed, mostly because I didn't want this to drag on through back channels and text messages. The restaurant had a private room in the back with a long table and dim lights. When I walked in, they were already seated. Mom, Dad, Natalie, and Gavin. Natalie looked away when I sat down. Gavin gave a polite nod. Corey laid the ground rules. No interrupting, no blaming. "Just talk," Dad started. He said the loans were stacking up $10,000 a month in interest and that they might lose their house. Mom added that they never meant for it to go this far, but they'd wanted to give Natalie a good start, something stable to build on. I let them speak. Then I asked the question I had been holding since the day they showed up at my condo. Why is her dream house my responsibility? They didn't have an answer, just a look of confusion, like the question itself was foreign. I reminded them how I asked for help with tuition, how I brought them the numbers, how I worked nights and weekends and lived off leftovers while they bought her a car and covered her trips. They didn't argue, just listened quietly. Natalie spoke up, then her voice sharper than the others. She said, "I was obsessed with the past, that I couldn't let go of what happened years ago, and that I didn't understand what she was trying to build. I told her I understood more than she thought because Gavin had told me the truth about the credit cards." Her eyes flicked toward him, then away. Mom asked if it was true, and Natalie hesitated, then said it was fine. She had a plan to pay it off. Corey raised a hand to settle the room and asked what I was willing to do. I took a breath and said, "I wouldn't pay $1 million, but I'd offer $20,000 to help ease the loan pressure. On one condition, they had to meet with a financial advisor, and the calls and group texts had to stop. Dad said it wasn't enough." Mom shook her head. Natalie stood up, grabbed her bag, and said, "She knew I'd let them down." Gavin said nothing, just stared at the tabletop. The meeting ended. There, no agreement, no handshakes, just quiet frustration as everyone filed out. I drove back to Austin with the windows down, trying to clear my head. By the time I got home, it was dark and the porch light was still on. I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out a notebook. My therapist had once told me to write a letter, not to send, just to get the words out. So I wrote about all of it. The birthdays, the college rejection, the holidays that came and went without so much as a phone call, the jobs, the debt, the silence. I wrote until the page was full and my hand was cramping, and for the first time in a long while I felt still the... Next morning I put the letter in a drawer and turned my attention to work. The housing project was in a fragile place, the client nervous because of whispers they'd heard online. I spent the next 2 weeks reassuring them, checking budgets, reworking plans, doing everything I could to keep it from slipping through my hands. And while everything else moved forward, something in me had paused like a door half open, waiting for what came next. The next few weeks were quiet in that strange way where, something's still coming. I kept my phone on silent during work hours and stayed off social media as much as possible, but even with the volume turned down, I could still feel the hum of it beneath everything like a pressure building behind a wall. Then one afternoon a new message came in. Not from Natalie or my parents, but from Gavin. He asked if we could meet again just briefly, somewhere public. I suggested a bench near the lake trail where I sometimes walked after work. We met there the following Saturday. The sun low enough to throw shadows across the path. He looked tired, but more clear-eyed than before. He said Natalie hadn't taken the meeting well, and things had been tense at home. He didn't ask for money, didn't push. Instead, he said, "Thank you for what you tried to do, even if they couldn't see it." I nodded. We sat there for a few minutes, watching the water, neither of us needing to say much else back at the office. The housing project finally stabilized. The clients were reassured, contracts signed again. The false rumors quieted down once I had time to focus on real work. The weight I'd been carrying loosened, just a little. Then a call came from Mom. Not a text, this time a voice-to-voice call. Her tone wasn't sharp like before, just flat. She said, "Tracy, we've been thinking about what you said." I didn't answer right away, she said. "We didn't realize how much we leaned on you or how little we gave you growing up." I waited, then heard Dad in the background. He got on the line and said, "We thought we were being fair. We thought we were doing what was best for both of you. But looking back, we see it wasn't balanced. We're sorry, Tracy." His voice caught on the word. Sorry, like it didn't fit quite right. I said, "Thanks for saying that, but I needed more than words. I needed boundaries. No more group texts, no more surprise visits, and no more pressure." They agreed to try. It was awkward but quiet. Not a fight, not a win, just a shift. About a week later, I was at a coffee shop sketching ideas for a new development when Natalie showed up. I hadn't seen her since the restaurant meeting. She looked different, her hair pulled back, no makeup, dark circles under her eyes. She said I didn't call first. "Figured you might say no," I said. "What do you want?" And she sat down slowly across from me. She said, "Gavin told me some of what you said at the meeting, and I've been thinking about things I didn't see before." She paused, looked out the window and then back at me. She said, "I'm $75,000 in debt. Tracy and I didn't even realize how deep it had gotten." Her voice cracked a little, but she kept going, said, "I blamed you for not helping. But the truth is, I never learned how to manage anything. I always thought someone would fix it for me." She looked down at her hands, twisting the corner of her napkin, and said, "I'm sorry for what I said for the posts, for acting like you owed me anything." I let the silence sit for a while before answering. I said thank you, but apologies. Don't undo everything. She nodded, said, "I know," but then asked, "How did you do it? How did you get out of debt and build all this on your own?" I was caught off guard for a second, but opened my sketchbook and started explaining, not the emotional part, just the basics: interest rates, payment, snowball methods, budgeting apps, credit limits, and where to look for financial counseling. She wrote it all down in a little notebook. Said, "Nobody ever taught me this stuff. Can we do this again sometime?" I said. "Maybe let's see how it goes." She smiled a little and said, "I could use a sister." I didn't promise anything, but I didn't shut the door either. After that conversation, the phone calls from my parents started to slow down. They still checked in, but they stopped asking for things. Natalie took a job as a social media manager and started chipping away at her debt. Gavin stood by her, and their dream home plans were replaced with talk of a modest townhouse outside the city limits. It wasn't a perfect ending, not a ribbon-tied kind of closure, but it felt like the storm had passed. The house was still standing, and I was still standing too. Things didn't change overnight, but there was a different kind of quiet after that conversation with Natalie. The texts from Mom turned lighter, short updates about the weather or a new recipe she wanted to try. Dad called once just to ask how my project was going. No requests, no loaded pauses, just a few minutes of normal. Natalie kept her distance, but she followed through. She emailed a few weeks later, asking for the name of the budgeting app I'd mentioned, and said she'd canceled one of her cards. She wasn't trying to prove anything, just quietly working on it with the mansion dream officially behind them. She and Gavin found a small townhouse in Pflugerville outside the city. It was 2 bedrooms and needed work, but they moved in with borrowed furniture and a plan to start fresh. I drove by once out of curiosity and saw Natalie out front pulling weeds in sneakers and an old college sweatshirt. It didn't feel like a show, just life. As for me, I started paying attention to the things I'd put off once the pressure lifted. I looked around at the firm I'd built at the home I owned and realized I'd never actually celebrated any of it. Not really. Everything had been about pushing forward, keeping steady, making sure nothing fell apart. I took a few days off for the first time in over a year, stayed home, cooked dinner every night, read the novel I'd bought last summer and never opened. Monica came over. One night with a bottle of wine and asked what was next. I told her I wasn't sure, but that I'd been looking at an international real estate course, something online with a short residency abroad. She lit up. Immediately said, "This is your moment. You should do it, not for a resume, just for you." So I enrolled the course, ran 6 months with most of it online, and a final trip to London. I planned my calendar around it, blocked off meetings and cleared space. I hadn't dared take before it felt indulgent and a little scary. But the more I leaned into it, the more natural it felt when I told Clifford. He nodded and said it was a smart move. Not for the market, not for expansion, just because I was worth the investment that landed harder than I expected. And I sat with those words for a long time after we hung up. Around the same time, I reached out to the architecture program at the University of Texas and asked how I could start a small scholarship fund. Something manageable at first $5,000 a year. Enough to help with books or lab fees. For one student, they connected me with a coordinator who helped me set it up. We talked through the application process, the type of student I hoped to support, and what the money could cover. I didn't want plaques or recognition, just a quiet way to pass something forward. The name on the account wasn't mine. It was listed under a phrase I'd written in that letter, tucked in my drawer, for the one who kept going. No fanfare. Just a gesture that felt like closing a loop. The days stretched into weeks, and something about the pace finally felt right. The firm was steady, my team growing slowly and thoughtfully. The London trip was booked, and I'd started brushing up on local regulations and zoning laws in the evenings just for fun. I hadn't told my parents yet about the course or the fund or the travel plans, not because I was hiding it, but because I no longer needed their reaction to shape the decision. It was mine all the way through, still something in me, wondered what they'd say, not the old part of me that craved their approval. Just a quiet part that wished things had been different all along. A few days before my trip to London, Mom called again. This time it wasn't about the house or Natalie or anything she needed. She just wanted to know if I had time for lunch, she said. They'd be in Austin visiting old friends and had a free afternoon. I told her I'd meet them near campus at a place with outdoor seating and simple sandwiches. When I arrived, they were already seated. Dad stood when he saw me, like he used to. When I was a teenager coming back from school, he asked about my firm, and I gave him a brief update. Nothing detailed, just enough to answer the question. Mom said she'd seen a photo of my project on a local business page and thought the building looked beautiful. I thanked her and changed the subject quickly. We talked about small things, the weather, how traffic had gotten worse, what they were watching lately. It felt almost like catching up with distant relatives, the kind you still recognize but don't quite know anymore. When the check came, Dad reached for it, said it was their treat, and I let him. I walked back to my car, wondering if maybe this was their version of trying to repair things, not with apologies this time, but with presence, with small gestures instead of explanations. 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane to London for the final part of my real estate course. It was my first time flying overseas for something that was entirely mine. Not work, not family, just a step forward on my own terms. The week was full of meetings and walking tours and late-night notes taken in hotel lobbies. I met people from across the globe, and for the first time in a long time didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. When I came home, the city felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. I stopped by the office to check in with my team, then drove across town to visit the community center I'd designed back in my intern days. They'd recently added a mural to the outer wall, bright colors layered over clean lines. I stood across the street for a moment watching kids chase a soccer ball through the lot. A few days later, Monica invited me to a small dinner at her place. Just a few close friends, nothing formal. She pulled me aside after dessert and said, "I hope you know how proud I am of you, and not because of your degrees or your business, because you built a life and didn't let the people who didn't see your worth keep you small." I didn't say anything, just gave her a long hug when I got home that night. There was a message waiting from Natalie. She said she'd gotten her credit card balance down below $50,000 and had picked up a freelance client on the side. It wasn't a celebration, just a note, an update from someone who'd learned to work quietly too. She said, Gavin's parents had helped them find a financial advisor and they'd started saving for the first time. She didn't ask for anything, just ended. Just with hope, London was amazing, and maybe we could talk soon. I wrote back a few lines, nothing big, just that it was good to hear from her, and I was glad things were moving in a better direction. The next morning, I got an email from the university. Someone had been selected for the scholarship. I'd started a sophomore named Elena who was working 2 part-time jobs and studying design with a focus on community housing. They included a thank you letter she'd written by hand, scanned and attached in neat handwriting. She wrote that the funds would help her cut back on her overnight shift and allow more time to finish her portfolio. I read the letter twice, then printed a copy, and tucked it into the back of the drawer where I'd kept the first letter I ever wrote to myself, back when everything still felt raw. There was no headline, no announcement, no family party. But justice didn't always show up with fireworks. Sometimes it just settled in like quiet balance, returned after a long time leaning one Saturday morning. Not long after the London trip, I found myself walking through the neighborhood farmers market, a fresh coffee in one hand and no particular place to be. It was the kind of slow morning I used to think belonged to other people, the kind who didn't always have something to prove or somewhere to catch up from, as I passed a vendor selling handmade journals. One caught my eye. It had a deep green cover and a stitched spine. I picked it up without thinking, paid in cash, and tucked it under my arm. Later that day, I brought it to my office, sat at my desk and wrote down the names of every project I'd ever touched, not for a resume or a client, just for myself. I thought about the letter still tucked away in the back of the drawer, the one I'd written after that long restaurant meeting, the one that marked the start of everything changing, not just between me and my family, but inside me too. I hadn't read it in a while, but I didn't need to. The words had already done their work. Natalie and I still weren't close, not in the way people imagine sisters should be, but we were talking slowly, carefully, with more honesty than before. She sent me photos, sometimes of the townhouse she and Gavin were fixing up, little things, a painted door, new shelves, herbs growing in mismatched pots on the windowsill. My parents stayed in touch more regularly, too. Their messages were shorter these days, simpler, birthday wishes, quick check-ins, a recipe forwarded from an old neighbor. It wasn't the relationship I once hoped for, but it was honest and quiet, and for now, that was enough. The scholarship at the university grew slowly. By the second year, I was able to double the award, still small, but enough to cover more than books. The coordinator sent updates every spring, and I read every line like a postcard from a version of my younger self who finally had someone in her corner. Sometimes, I still wonder what might have been if they had said yes to USC, if they had believed in me back then, the way I had to learn to believe in myself. But I don't stay there long now. Those questions used to feel like stones in my pocket now. They're just echoes, soft and far behind me. In the end, I didn't build my life out of anger. I built it out of clarity. I stopped asking for permission to take up space. I stopped proving and started choosing. And somewhere along the way, I realized the greatest justice wasn't in the apology or the recognition. It was in the peace that came after. If you've ever had to draw a hard line with someone you love, or carry yourself through a season where no one showed up for you. Just know it doesn't make you cold. It makes you strong, and that strength doesn't have to be loud to be real. Thanks for sitting with me through this. If any part of my story sounded familiar or reminded you of your own, I hope you'll share it in the comments, or just let someone know they're not alone. And if you're still on your way to building something that's just yours, keep going, it's worth it. Even when no one claps for you at the start, you're not behind, you're just becoming who you were always meant to be.